Hello everyone, and welcome back to 404. In this episode, we're taking a step away from the political sphere to sit down with the award-winning composer Gareth Coker. Gareth is best known for his work on Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, but is also one of 3 composers involved with the upcoming soundtrack for Halo Infinite. This is my longest interview to date, so when I say sit back and relax this time, I really mean it. If you have any questions relating to this episode, or would like to recommend someone for the podcast, you can email us at johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. That's johnson.business.yt@gmail.com. So without further ado, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Perfect. Gareth, thanks so much for sitting down with me today. I understand that not only you're extremely busy with music at the moment, and of course onto stuff that we're going to get into later, but I also understand from listening to interviews that you're a very big Assassin's Creed fan, so I've probably taken you away from the latest installment of Valhalla as well, have I?
If I had more time to be playing it, then yes, but I have started it. I'm out of Norway, and I'm in England. But then I saw the size of the England map. I'm like, I'm going to need like a week off during Christmas to play this properly, because it's so big. But actually, I'm really enjoying it so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's actually because I actually haven't fully played it yet because I'm waiting until I get my Xbox Series X before I go near it, which are obviously in very high demand at the moment. But no, I was listening to this because what I do usually before getting into games is I listen to the score beforehand, just get an idea of it. And I always like kind of making up ideas in my head of what the score is trying to portray. Yeah. And then I get to it later. I'm like, oh, that's what that means, or this is what this is doing. But a fantastic score. I believe it's by the same composer who did the score for the Call of Duty Modern Warfare as well, which is another personal favorite of mine recently. But anyway, sorry.
She also did Assassin's Creed Origins as well, and she worked on Unity, I think, a little bit. So she's been part of the franchise for a while. But she worked in conjunction with Jesper Kyd, who did Assassin's Creed 2 and 1, who created the franchise's like musical identity, and they worked with the with Einar Selvig, the singer. I think he's from Iceland. It's either Iceland or Denmark, one of the two. So the kind of the 3 of them combined, I think it's something like crazy, like 6 hours of music in the game or something. it's a lot. So, but yeah, no, it's a really good score.
Yeah, but they've obviously then got that very good continuity between the games as well, if they're obviously working together so much. So like obviously that's going to benefit them in the long run, even if they're changing so many settings, you still have that sort of distinctive Assassin's Creed feel, I'd imagine, as well.
Yeah.
I want to first of all begin, and I'm not sure if this is the first interview you've done since getting the news, but congratulations on being nominated for Game Score of the Year for Ori and the Will of the Wisps.
Thank you. Yes, that was pretty cool to get nominated. Got nominated in 2015 for Ori 1, but this year has been so insane for video games.
Yeah.
I mean, there's still more to come. With Cyberpunk being around the corner. To be nominated alongside 4 other ridiculously amazing soundtracks. They're all different. Like, I mean, if you're on the jury, how do you pick? Because they all do different things. They're all in different genres. And they all handle music implementation differently. So it's like, it's going to come down to taste. Because if I was on jury, I could easily make a case for any one of those scores to be the winner. So I'm glad I'm not. So I'm just going to enjoy the night, and like seriously, it's one of those that like whoever wins, it's a round of applause, because like everyone on that nomination list definitely, you could make a case for them deserving it. And then there's a bunch of scores that didn't get nominated as well. This year has been, in my opinion, the strongest year for gaming since I entered the industry, and maybe ever. So that's just my opinion. I think it's been a crazy good year.
Yeah, the one positive to the year, I might add.
Yes.
But no, there's some fantastic scores in there, because even myself, I'm a huge fan of your work with specifically for Ori. I think that's how I first got introduced to your work, and then I went back down through the pipeline listening to everything from the Mean Greens to In Momentum and whatnot.
Oh my goodness, you really went into the archives.
Yeah, which I was surprised. I don't know. In Momentum doesn't seem to be on your website, but when you look it up on Spotify, it's under your name. So
Yeah, it might have just fallen off because it's the oldest release. But yeah, it's on my Bandcamp, I think.
yeah, we'll mask it
yeah.
as my brilliant research skills, if that's okay.
Yes, exactly.
But some brilliant scores, as you mentioned, like particularly obviously Mick Gordon has already won game soundtrack of the year with Doom 2016. Doom Eternal, I think, amplifies that even more. Like so, but as you mentioned, such different soundtracks, because obviously nothing in comparison to Ori in regards to first listening to it on the ear, like, and the same with The Last of Us as well, as a brilliant soundtrack. Is there any, I know you mentioned that you think they're all brilliant soundtracks, but is there any soundtrack in particular that you're very impressed with, besides obviously your own work?
I think, so when it comes to like looking at how, what other soundtracks are doing, the bare minimum for me is that the music is good. Like, I'd like that should be automatic. Obviously what does good mean? But like, it should be well produced, it should be well composed, all of that stuff, well orchestrated if you're using orchestra, well arranged if you're doing the guitar, that hybrid guitar metal electronic sound that only Mick Gordon can do. So the next stage for me is like, how does it make you feel when you play? Because I don't think it's good enough. I just don't think it's good enough to have a game soundtrack that has great music. And I think that's what I look for when I'm playing a game. How does it make me feel while I'm playing? And I think the number of soundtracks that do that is far lower. Like, there's a lot of games that came out this year that had fantastically produced soundtracks, but when you play them during the game, there's a slight disconnect. Like, when you're playing through, you're like, this is fantastic music, but should it be playing here? Or why is it playing here? And in terms of implementation, let's just take Doom for an example. Like, it always matches the gameplay, and it changes very quickly, because I don't know the system, but it sounds like they're putting together lots of very short chunks and kind of arranging it in real time. Yeah, with Ori, we changed the music in real time, but not in big chunks. Like, it's just the points where we change the music are very, very strictly defined by certain actions that you complete. It can be something as simple as Ori pulling a lever and a door opens somewhere, and that's a place to change the music cue. The point is the transitions are invisible, or they're covered up by a visual on screen. Have you played Will of the Wisps?
I'm only halfway through it now, and I have to say that's my it's the worst part so far.
It's a big
I
game.
am at the spider part at the moment, which I think I've gone in a bit too prematurely too.
Okay, yeah, that's a tough one to start off with. Okay, but if you remember, you're probably past the watermill, right? Do you remember there was a room which rotated 90 degrees each time?
Yeah.
Right. So that every time you might not have even noticed it because it's very subtle, but it's a small thing. So each time you pull the lever, the same arrangement of that piece of music that plays in that room plays, but at a slightly quicker tempo and at a slightly higher pitch. And it's just a simple way of like amping up the tension in a very subtle way as well. Because it does get a little bit more difficult in terms of the platforming each time. And some people fly through that room and they won't actually hear like all of the music that I wrote for that room, because the platforming's maybe easy for them. But some people will spend a long time in there because they don't see the route or the path, or they don't execute it properly. But yeah, that's just like each time the musical transition is invisible, because when you pull the lever, you zoom out a little bit and then you get the mass of sound effects, and like that hides the musical transition, so it doesn't feel gimmicky. Because there's one thing, my pet peeve in games, and it's especially hard in open world games, is when you can hear the musical transitions or they just fade out the music. And in Ori, that's almost impossible because there's music the whole time. That's part of the DNA of the game. If you compare with Doom, like when the battle ends, like we generally cut to an ambient track or we cut to nothing. But there's always a clear ending when you kill the last monster. But in Ori, the game is so free flowing. There's no start or end to anything. The whole game is about flow. And so to like find all of these implementation points. I mean, I spent hours and hours and hours playing the game. Like, where can I change the music that it makes sense, but also we pair the music enough to make it memorable for the player? Because if you don't hear a loop for long enough, you don't get into it and it doesn't bring you in. But like, if you make the loops too short, it becomes repetitive. If you make it too long, the player doesn't have a chance to get it in their head. So if you look at most of the loops in Ori, they're between 3 minutes and 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Because that's the length, like 3.5 minutes is the length of a good pop song. And that's generally how I structure most of my gameplay tracks, are structured in song form. They do have a verse, they have a chorus, not in the traditional sense with lyrics, they're just structured that way.
Yeah.
And that format lends itself well to being repeated. Doom doesn't have that problem of like, how to deal with repetition, because it's like it's all being composed in real time. But the Doom score, I think it's fair to say it doesn't handle melody and riffs in the same way as Ori does, because Ori's melodies are long. Like they are, they're a good like 30 to 40 second statement. I think you would struggle to find a 30 to 40 second statement of anything in Doom, because a lot of the riffs are so short and the gameplay is so fast, and that's fine. The point I'm basically taking a long time to make is that Doom's score is perfect for that kind of game. And I think, I'm biased, obviously, I think Ori's score is perfect for the kind of game it is. And I think always a good sign of a game, an effective game soundtrack, is that you can't replace it with anything else. Because you can't replace and doubly so for Doom, because you can't find anyone to like do that sound. It's like, that's not a sound that grows on a tree. And it's funny because people like say Ori's just another orchestral soundtrack. No, it isn't. Like, I'm gonna be honest, try and find something that sounds exactly the same. No, because it isn't just an orchestral soundtrack. There's a lot of synthetic elements going on. There's a lot of instruments from all around the world, and that's all combined together with how I write for the orchestra, and then all of the musical effects that I put on top of that. Because if you compare the orchestral sound of Ori to a concert hall orchestra, they sound completely different. Like, if you just took because there's actually concert hall recordings of Ori, and if you compare like the same music to what it is on this concert hall and to what is in the soundtrack, they're completely different. There's a reason for that. Like, it's not like I'm not following all the rules and like the orchestra must sound like it's in the concert hall. The orchestra in Ori sounds like what I think suits the game. And that's why I talk about all of these soundtracks like being deserving of a win, because you can't really take them out of the game and replace them with anything else. They all do their own thing, and you can see the decisions behind them. They're not just putting well-produced music on top of the game and calling it a day. I feel like every time a piece of music plays in any of these games, the reason for that music playing has been thought out properly, and it's been thought out not from the point of view of a composer. It's been thought out from the point of view of a player who's playing the game. And that, to me, especially going forward into the next decade of gaming, is going to be what differentiates a good soundtrack and a great soundtrack. It's not enough to just supply good music. Like, now you have to like think like, how is this going to make the player feel when they play? And that is why I get out of bed in the morning. Like, everyone talks about Ori being the feels game, but it's actually more than that. It's not just about the emotional cutscenes. It's everything that builds into the emotional cutscenes, and you're feeling when you're doing the escape. Like, when you did the escape from the watermill for the first time, it's like I handled the escape music a little bit different than I did in the first game. In the first game, the escape music's a little bit more tense, but in the second game, I'm like, well, Ori's done this before. This is like not new to him. So actually, if you compare the escape music from the first game to the second game I feel, and it's being reflected by, I read all the comments. I know they say don't read the comments, but I do. But the music is slightly more confident than what it was in the first game. Now the boss fights, on the other hand, the music is tense and crazy and over the top, because Ori's never had to like fight a massive creature face to face before. Yeah, so that's handled a lot differently. And we do ramp up the tension there. But like the point is that like every single musical decision I've made, and I think these other composers and their musical teams have made, has been heavily thought out, and that is where game music is going. And I think it's pretty cool, because for the longest time it was just a battle to get well-produced music in a game. But now, I mean, look at all the top soundtracks for AAA games this year. They all sound great. Like, you can't really argue that they're not well produced, or they're not well composed. But so then you're like looking elsewhere. It's like, well, how did it make me feel during the game? And so like the jury is gonna have to play significant chunks of the game, all the games, to make a proper decision, to like actually get a feel for how the music plays back in all of those games, to get an idea of how it feels. Because I can say for Ori 2, I mean, the whole game builds up to the ending. I'm not going to spoil it for you, obviously, but like, if you think it's intense now, just wait until you get to the end. Like let's say the last boss fight takes you 15 minutes. I don't know how long it will take you. It might take you longer, it might take you less time, but let's just say it takes 15 minutes. There's there's a cutscene before, which is about 5 minutes long, and then there's the end game, which is 7 minutes long. So that's 5 plus 15, 20. So like 27 minutes. That last 27 minutes is all continuous musically, and it's made up of 10 different cues, I think, or close to 10. And it's probably the single most it's the segment of music that I'm most proud of, like, in my career. Like, I know we nailed the ending, and like musically, like I'm very proud of like how we got there, but I'm not. I hope the jury gets there, because it takes a long time to get to the end of the game. It was pretty cool to do that end sequence, because it's cutscene, then it's a multi-phase boss fight, and each phase has its own unique music track, and then there's 3 cutscenes back to back for the ending, and everything's seamless. And one of the cutscenes is interactive, which also has its own implications for timing and pacing and all of that stuff. You'll find most game composers who get really into like the implementation of the game. We know the games better than the players by far. Like we know it inside out. Like you can ask me anything about any level in Ori, and I can probably tell you everything about it. And that's the nature of the job now. And I feel like game music is in an exciting spot, because a lot of composers are now thinking about the player experience and not just about supplying good music. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, fantastic. Just talking a little bit, bringing it back a little bit, you mentioned about masking music as it changes with the sound of the game.
Yes.
How much are you communicating with the guys in sound design about getting these certain aspects to fit up just right, or is it kind of you?
I mean, that's so for Ori 2, it depends on the game as well, and like how each team is set up very, very differently. For Ori 2, we worked with a sound team who had a dedicated person handling ambiances and music tracks and how they played back. Ambiances being the forest sounds and stuff like that. And he was the one responsible for setting all the music playback. But in terms of like coming to an agreement with sound, I mean, I like to work with the sound anyway when I'm writing music. So I'm already writing around the sound effects. I think that's like an essential part of the job. I also think it's why the music and sound in Ori meshes as well as it does. In terms of like the collaboration, I mean, they're literally, the whole team is like a Skype message away, and that's if I need something or I need a question answered, I can get the answer pretty quickly. But again, because I'm writing around the sound effects, I'm basically doing a bunch of pre-production that will save time down the road, because I'm making decisions very early on in the process so that down the line, when like music and sound is blaring, I've made it less competitive, because one of the biggest issues we had in terms of like balancing the two things, like, hey, we've got the boss fights, we need really big sound effects and we need really big music, and that, you know, that just doesn't work. So I was like, okay, well, let me do this with minimal percussion. And I was like, the energy needs to come elsewhere, because when you bang things, it creates like a hard transient. And if you think of like every monster attack, it's always like doing like a slap sound. Now think about drums; they are fundamentally the same mechanic. And so if you have drum sounds doing the same thing as something that's trying to hit you, it's just gonna like not work at all, because it's just gonna sound confusing to the ear. So I'm like, okay, we're going to remove all of those kinds of instruments from the equation. But then I'm like, well, where does the energy come from? Because one of the easiest ways to add energy to music is add a bunch of drums doing crazy stuff. It works. It just works. But like, I'm like, now I have to do more with the other instruments to get the energy into the music. And More of the Spider is actually a great example of like it's a very, very energetic track. It's quite difficult for the musicians to play at that level of intensity because it's like 6 minutes long. But getting that energy in something that doesn't have a hard attack, when you have a violin bow, they're not banging against it. It's a scrape. Or scrape is the wrong word, but like it's just not hard. But when you do that quickly, there's so much energy in all of that movement that it transfers into the music, and thus it transfers to the player. So it's all about capturing energy, but in a way that didn't take away from the sound effects. You need to hear the sound effects because it telegraphs like what the spider is going to do, and the player needs to hear that so they can maybe prepare for the next attack. Obviously, they're looking at the animation as well, but I mean, you can get an idea just of how much I've just talked about one aspect of like a piece of music. And then there's like all of the other stuff that's in the spider track as well. And that's just for one boss fight in the game. Like, this level of thought goes into every single piece of music in the game. And the talk between sound and music it has to be constant. Otherwise you just end up with what can sound like a mess at the end of the game. And you don't want it to be a mess. You want music to have its moments, and you want sound to have its moments. You haven't got there yet, but there's a great scene.
You can talk about it if you want, if it's any
consolation. I mean, this isn't really a spoiler. I mean, you've met actually, yeah, you have. So you've met Shriek, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah. And have you met Shriek in the desert yet? Where
no.
she like comes from the background and comes to the foreground. I mean, we put the shot in the trailer, so it's not a huge
feel free
spoiler.
to go.
But there's like a sequence where you're basically playing hide and seek with Shriek, and you have to like kind of stealthily get through the environment, like from one point to another, and you've got a limited amount of time. There, like, the music just goes way back, because what makes the scene powerful for the player, you got this giant friggin' owl thing with weird legs stalking you, and I'm like, there's no piece of music that is going to be better than what the sound can do here, because that's the dominant feature on the screen. And so I'm like, sound team, this is all you, pretty much. Like, I'll give you some like musical ambience, but like, you need to sell this scene. And they did. And because your eyes are focused only on Shriek, and you're not doing a bunch of crazy platforming because your eyes are focused on Shriek, and if you move, you're gonna get killed pretty quick. Hearing every single Shriek sound is much more valuable to the player than some tense piece of music. Now, conversely, the final boss fight, when you fight Shriek, there's all this crazy stuff going on, and it's like the big last hurrah. But and there's so much movement happening. But because this is a very still scene, and music by definition usually has movement, I'm like, we need to take all the movement out, and it's just literally some drones and like a pad or something. And what makes the scene interesting is like hearing every single footstep, every single like neck movement, the rustle of feathers, every like vocalization. That's what makes the scene powerful. And that was a very easy decision. I was like, I mean, to be frank, I was like, hey guys, I mean, there's a ton of music in the game. Can I take a break? You know, it's and you know, they were only too happy to like to take it up. Because yeah, it's just those kinds of decisions. You know, I was lucky in that me and the sound team saw the game in the same way. So there were never really any battles on how to like handle things. It was more just about like, can I get sound effects from you so I can like hear what does this creature sound like? What does this boss sound like? You know, what does the spider sound like? So I can get a feel for what frequency ranges are being used by the sound team, and then I can work around those in the music. But I would say that the Moon Studios team, all of the departments are talking to each other all the time. You've played Ori games now. I think it's pretty hard to deny that there's a synergy between every single element of the game, and that's what makes Ori feel the way it does. Is everything is working together in harmony. I think the individual parts are strong. I mean, obviously the art looks amazing, the animation's really high quality, the gameplay is pretty fun, all that stuff. So yeah, individually, like it all works, but like when they're all working in harmony, and you have Bash now. I mean, once you have Bash in the game, I think playing Ori, like that's when you're combining the Bash ability with the dash ability. I mean, you can just like zoom around the map in no time at all, and I don't think that ever gets old. Like, and when all of that is working in harmony with the new visuals that are being thrown at you, a new piece of music when you enter a new area, I think it's a tough game to put down. Well, clearly you put it down, but so it's clearly not that hard. But like, that's a little dig. But yeah, it's all of the departments at Moon Studios are talking to each other all of the time in order to create a better experience for the player. Like that, and that's really all it comes down to. It's like we're not serving ourselves. Like as artists, we are trying to serve the player. That's a good quote. That should be at the top of your interview.
That'll be in the Twitter
Serve
clip
the
when I put
player,
it
not
out.
yourself.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about your inspiration into getting into not only games composition, but you obviously did a lot in sort of short films and a bit of TV, I think, on the side as well, was it? Yeah. I read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Alan Silvestri was one of your main influences in getting into music, and most people will know him for his work such on like Predator, Forrest Gump, even the more recently people will know him for Avengers. Was he your main inspiration into, say, gaming composition, or was there someone else who kind of overshone him in that regard?
Honestly, I wouldn't say there's a particular person who influenced me for games composition. I wanted to do music for games because it's the medium I know best. I've been playing games since I was 4 years old. That really is the simple answer. I didn't become aware of game music until Final Fantasy VII. So if you want an answer, that's probably where it began, because like that's the first time I became aware of the power of it. In terms of other scores from like my early gaming life, the original Deus Ex by Alex Brandon, and the early LucasArts adventure games by Pete McConnell, like Day of the Tentacle and Grim Fandango, and actually the early Star Wars games. You know, EA have just released Star Wars Squadrons, which is really a throwback to the games that came out on floppy disk back in 1992, Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars TIE Fighter. How old are you, by the way? You might not even have
21,
been alive.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, you don't know about any of these. Now you're gonna have to look. Now you're gonna have to do even more research.
I know I am aware of X-Wing TIE Fighter. Don't worry,
okay,
not that
but
bad.
like, I mean, okay, but like these, but yeah, I mean, these games came out on floppy disks and they had fully interactive scores. You know, they were all done with MIDI, but they changed on the fly, like based on what was happening in the game. It's funny because I hear all the time, like, we got to improve the implementation in game music. I'm like, no, the concepts have been around for literally decades. It's about the execution. Anyway, so like those were probably my early influences, but I wouldn't say I have a particular composer in games that I was crazy about. I want to be like that person. I will say that I'm drawn to melody because I think it's, first of all, it's a signature of my music, and second of all, I think there's less of it these days. I find, I'm not ashamed to say, I find most pop music forgettable. But it's McDonald's. It's in one ear and out the other. It's good in the moment, but most of the stuff that's on the radio today we won't be listening to in 2 years, let alone 10 years. Yet we'll still be listening to the Beatles and Michael Jackson in 100 years, guaranteed, because melody is king, and riffs and motifs and ideas like that are king. So I'm generally drawn to the composers who lead with melody first, and I'm drawn to the composers, and this is probably what I think. Final Fantasy VII is a good benchmark. It's one of the greatest scores of all time. It's packed with melody, but here's the other thing: it's not afraid to wear its heart on its sleeve. Mm-hmm. There's so many scores, I think, now that are a little bit apologetic. They're almost afraid to make like a big musical statement because they don't want to hold the player's hand or hold the viewer's hand. And I think that's a missed opportunity. I think actually people want that when they go see a film. I think when people want to see a film, they want the music to sweep them away and take them off their feet. And that's how I approach game music. And so my favorite era of film scoring is the 90s, because there are a lot of those scores like that. Have you watched, you must have seen Braveheart.
Of course, yeah.
Right. That film, the music, if they submitted the music like how it plays in the film in 2020, it wouldn't get approved because some of it's really on the nose, like really on the nose. And I'm just like, yeah, I'm watching it. I'm like, they don't make movies like this anymore. But that's what I like about it, because like he's not afraid to James Horner was not afraid to go all out like on the delivery of the emotion in that score. And yes, it is, it can be a bit, heading towards the saccharine and the cheesy sometimes, but that's actually what people want. They want to have something, because that's what makes the film memorable, because they committed to an idea and then they executed it to the to the maximum. But you can look at all the films like that during that time period. I mean, E.T. is actually earlier, but like that's kind of like when it started. You've seen E.T. I don't want to spoil it. Right. So the whole film.
You don't need to worry about spoiling such an old movie at this stage.
The whole film is built up to the flying scene. That is the release point of the entire movie. The whole film is pretty much centered around that point. And they take everything out, and you just hear the kids screaming and yelping, and the theme plays. And the theme plays loud and proud, and they don't interrupt it. And I think I may have to check my answer on this, but I think they recut that scene to John Williams's music, because I think Steven Spielberg wanted to make sure that you heard it in full. I'm not 100% sure on that though, but I heard a rumor on the grapevine that was the case. But the point is really that like the music is allowed to play in full, and everything just takes a step back, and you're just left with this magnificent visual, iconic visual, and the music, and you're swept up in it. It's like the music is giving you permission to feel whatever you are feeling. And that's having an opportunity to score a game like Ori is, it's rare to get an opportunity like that where you can. Have you played the first game? Again, I'm going to keep asking
I've
about
played the first game.
Right. So the ending of the first game, it's pretty on the nose musically, and that's okay. Like that's just my opinion. And it's like, if you scored, there's a million ways you can write music for a scene, but I think I like the direction to go is always to be committed to the feeling that you want the player to have when they're playing. I'm not thinking I need to make the player cry here. I'm thinking I need the player to feel more connected to this scene so that they have an easier way of feeling what they need to feel. And so my job with the music is actually not to, you will be happy, you will be sad. My job is to make you feel what Ori is feeling. And it's about taking a point of view. Wow, that question started at like, what are your influences? And we ended up there. Just to wrap it up, the influences are really about melodists, like people who use melody, and people who and composers who aren't afraid to make a commitment or a statement with their music.
Just when you brought it up, actually,
I told you I was generous with my answers.
You actually brought up a very good point that actually kind of sprung on an added on question almost with regards to Ori, and how it's a little on the nose near the end of the first game. But I suppose in a sense, Ori needs to be on the nose because it's making up, because none of the characters speak in that game, so you're almost having to tell two stories, because, well, there is the text on the screen, but that's not really dialogue in the sense of the traditional sense. But you're almost having to tell the story of someone who can't speak, who can't, convey their emotions through that sense. So the music has to make up for that in a sense as well, which I think it does fantastically. But as you say, it probably warrants being a bit more on the nose in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, if I didn't feel it, if I felt it was actually a great example. It's from the end of the game. I don't even need to spoil the scene, because it can just show the power of music and like how it can change a scene. So in the penultimate cutscene of Ori 2, there's an interactive segment where you're just basically walking across the screen and stuff happens. And originally I had orchestra and choir playing at the same time. They were doing kind of the same thing. And I'm watching it and I'm just like, it's too much. Even for me, it was too much. I'm capable of dialing it back. I'm like, this is too much for the scene. Like now it feels like it's trying too hard. So I was like, how can I fix this? And I was like, well, what if I just muted the entire orchestra for this segment, and we just had the choir, and I was like, well, let's try that, because it's very easy to try. It's literally
So
one
is
mouse click.
is there a like a cut out there of the choir and the orchestra?
No, there isn't a cut of choir and orchestra. Like, I mean, I could put it, but there's certainly a recording of it, like, a very expensive recording that just didn't make the final cut. But I'm glad we recorded it because it meant I could try stuff out. Like,
Yeah.
and it's almost like the playing was so emotional and so good. I was like, man, this is like, it overpowers the scene. And I was like, we actually don't need to overpower the scene because the player needs to take in the visuals and what's happening. And I was like, let's take the orchestra out. So we have the choir. Now, human voices, when they're singing together, it's a very intimate sound. You live in Britain. It's choirs are everywhere and it's wonderful. Like when you hear them. And I was like, well, let's just only focus on that. And like having that by itself actually drew me in more. So by actually taking something away, it brought me closer. And it didn't feel overpowering anymore. So like that was an example of just where something was on the nose too much. And then this, it's still like telling giving the player a sense of what to feel, but it's not sledgehammer, because that's what it was originally. At some point I might like throw it up on YouTube, like just a comparison before and after. Here's what I did, and here's what it was before I like changed it, and it's crazy. Like I've been doing this for a while now, and you don't expect such a significant change like that. I mean, literally removing 70 players from the equation, you don't expect a change like have that much effect on the emotion of the music, but sometimes it can. And this was very late in the day. I mean, that was back in February this year. I mean, this was like a month before we shipped the game. Still making tweaks and changes to like how things feel, but I'm glad I made it. But you're right to mention that Ori's the kind of game that gives music to the space to do that, because not every game needs it. One of my favorite games from recent years is Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. There's actually not very much music in that game, except when they do use it, and it's very powerful when they do use it, because of all the. But if you had music all the time during that game, you wouldn't hear the voices that are on either side of the headphones, and it would take away from that. So actually, the voices are most of the soundtrack. And that's another example of a game where the thought of every single music cue is so well thought out all throughout the game. So it's like every single game is different. You have to, as a composer, you have to approach it in a different way with a different mindset. And ultimately, it's about what's best for the player.
I want to move back, and it feels like a couple of questions ago at this stage, but it's actually only one question. But when I mentioned Silvestri, I just wanted to ask, and this is on this might be the most bizarre question you've ever been asked, but you've obviously scored the Mean Greens, which is a 2015 release game. I think it got re-released again this year on the PlayStation 4, if I'm not mistaken.
It got re-released this year for console.
Yeah. But I want to know, and because I was looking through Silvestri's scores, and obviously I saw Predator, is there, at the beginning of the main theme, the marching bit at the beginning, is there a direct correlation between that and sort of the piano sort of piece, piano sort of theme of the Predator in any way, or is that
If
me
there
reading
is,
too
it's
much into it?
purely if there is, it's purely coincidence. So I can tell you with that game, Predator was the last thing on my mind. I mean, you've seen how ridiculous the game looks. It's but yeah, there was no real reference. It was really that sound of like the low piano with drums is kind of a staple of like old school action music, and old school action music. Like Silvestri isn't the first to do it. Jerry Goldsmith was doing it a lot. But yeah, the piano and low drum is a classic action sound that like recalls a certain era of film music, and that's kind of like what I was looking to reference. But yes, not the Predator, but you're in the right lines. You still reference the right musical idea, but it's just not the Predator score. But yeah, it's just it's a musical device that works almost every single time. You'll still hear it in action scores even today, especially Bond films.
Yeah, I actually, because even when listening, there's I think Deep Freeze is one of the track names, is it?
Oh, Deep Freeze definitely references Bond films.
Yeah, the string segment.
That I don't mind saying. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, I thought even when I was writing down that question, this is a complete and utter reach, but I'll ask it anyways. Let's talk a little bit about your sort of your studies with regards to music. You obviously started in the Royal Academy of Music in London, then moved on to Japan for I think 3 years, was it?
Yes.
And then you were over in University of Southern California. So a very diverse sort of career with regards to studies in music. Can you maybe point out to one key difference between all areas in which you've covered throughout your studies that maybe kind of spoke to you the most?
Well, first of all, like my time in Japan, I think this is a correction I need to make on my Wikipedia page. I actually was teaching English in Japan. I was actually not studying in Japan. That I think on my Wikipedia page it says I went to study ethnic instruments or music instruments from Asia or something like that. And that's partially true, you know, because obviously I'm a musician, I'm fascinated by all that, but I didn't go to school there. I went to teach. I said probably someone misinterpreted, like I was in a school and they thought that I was, you know, studying there. But no, I taught English for 3 years in Japan because I graduated from the Royal Academy of Music. I'm like, great, I have all these skills and no one's going to hire me because I'm 22 and no one cares because I haven't done anything. And I didn't have any connections. And I was like, first of all, I need a job, and second of all, I need to find out if I really want to do music for a career. And it was like late night Google searching, and I was like, teach English in Japan. I was like, oh, that sounds fun. And it's actually really well paid, and it was actually really, you know, a very fun 3 years. And even though, and this is it's a good question you've asked, because like even though on the surface it might not appear that I did, you know, very much musically while I was out there, my attitude, how I handle myself, how I talk to other people, how I run my business is entirely based on my time and experience in Japan. It's obviously tweaked a little bit, you know, I've been in America for 10 years now, 11 actually. But my philosophy to life is based on my work experience in Japan, how they work with others. Here's the thing. Japan is all about benefiting the group. How do you make a game? How do you make a film? You need a group of people. You need a group of people with very specialized individual talents, but you need them all to come together. Literally, what was I just saying on the question about all the departments working together for Ori? Like, it is the same thing. Like the philosophy in Japan is like, what can you do to benefit the group, and what can you do to not hurt the group in any way? And that philosophy it applies to games. It applies to standing in front of an orchestra. I was teaching English to 40 high school students, and high school students are annoying because everyone's annoying when they're 15, right? and you know, I got to make them, you know, I got to make them like me, and they've got to be paying attention to what I say. How is that much different to standing in front of an orchestra who you've never met before and who don't know any of the music that they're about to play? Most people don't know this, by the way, but when orchestras perform music for soundtracks, they've never seen the music before. They don't rehearse; they rehearse like on the day. So if you take the Ori 2 soundtrack, most of the soundtrack is take 3 or 4, and they never saw it before. Like, that's how good they are. So I just thought I'd add that because it usually blows people's minds. Yeah. But so that skill of, like, you know, being able to stand in front of people who you don't know and be able to communicate to them incredibly clearly. Because here's the other thing about standing in front of an orchestra: orchestras are expensive. So if you waste your words and let's say you spend 4 minutes explaining something instead of 2, well, that 2 minutes could have been used to record like the first phase of the boss track. Like, just to put it into perspective, and if you're paying X amount of dollars for the music recording, 2 minutes, like, that's a big chunk of time, because the musicians get paid on an hourly basis. So you've lost a big chunk of your recording time. So my time in Japan, like where I was teaching English, I was like, I just gotta remember, like, I'm back in teaching in the school. Whenever I stand in front of an orchestra, I'm always so scared, because you're literally standing in front of 70 people who know their instruments better than I ever will. They've been with them, and they're like, well, who is this guy? Because they see a different composer like every week. I'm like, oh, who is this schmuck that we're playing for? I mean, they know me now because I've done a lot of recording, but, like, you know, especially the first time, it's like, you know, they want to help you. They want to do their best for you, but they also want to know that you've got your stuff together. So it's like, you've got to speak confidently, clearly. And what I will say is, when I arrived in Japan, I was not very outgoing. I was pretty, you know, I was the classic music nerd who kind of like stayed holed up at home and just practiced. But Japan actually forced me to be a bit more outgoing, because I'm standing in front of a class of 40 kids 6 times a day. And the skills I picked up there, like, had a big effect on, you know, just how I approach my life now working in the entertainment industry. So it's not really like a direct musical thing. But, you know, being a composer is about writing music, but also we're in the entertainment business. The business side, like, because otherwise you don't get hired. Like, if you're not a nice person to work for, if you don't think about the team, if you don't think about the group, people aren't going to hire you. So, like, that's what I would say. It's maybe not the answer you're expecting. You might have been expecting some, like, more musically driven answer, but you asked me what had the most impact, and that's the honest truth. That did have the most impact.
No, yeah, it's probably a good sense that I don't know the answer to everything beforehand.
A little musical suffix though. Living in Japan for 3 years, the culture of that country, you're gonna experience it through the process of osmosis. Just by being in a country for 3 years, you're going to know more about Japanese music, whether it's pop music or traditional Japanese music. So just by being in another country, I got to experience, first of all, Japan, but also the rest of Asia, because it's much cheaper to travel to the rest of Asia when you're already there. But, like, imagine going there from Britain, you know, England to Japan, England to China, Hong Kong, whatever. It, you know, gets expensive pretty fast. But going from Japan to China, it's like a much shorter flight. So I was able to not just see Japan, but see a lot of Asia as well. And if you go through my soundtracks, you will definitely hear a lot of Asian influence. It's subtle, but it's there. And that's because, you know, I lived there for 3 years. So that to me is a benefit. Like, I think one thing that not just composers, but literally anyone in any creative field, obviously you can't do it now, but when you can, travel, because expanding your horizons helps art so much.
Yeah. Let's fast forward a little bit to 2011. I think the obvious question you think I'm going to ask is that, you know, you're obviously approached to the Ori prototype. I think you mentioned before that it was they heard your work on, was it a student film, and they kind of brought that to you and they wanted you to score a segment.
They heard my work on a student film, and yeah, it was on a profile on ModDB. Yeah.
But I'm more interested. I think, was your first was your first score release in the gaming scene, was it in Momentum?
Yes.
Yeah. So how did that kind of opportunity come around?
I was working on a mod. Literally, I can trace every single, like, career opportunity I've had. I can trace back to, like, that one profile on that one website. So I was working on a mod, and one of the developers on that mod was like doing his own game, and I was like, and he was like, it's this free running parkour game, and I was like, well, sure. At that point I was like, I'll do anything, I don't really care, because I needed to get experience. And he needed a composer, and he liked my stuff, and that was pretty much it. Because in the mod scene, there's there's a lot of composers, but there's a lot of developers too. There's a lot of games being made at the mod scene level, and I was like, yeah, sure, why not? And it turned up from being, it ended, it started being a one level thing, and then it kind of turned into its own game. And I don't think the release was hugely successful, but it didn't really matter. I proved to myself that I could ship a game and a complete soundtrack, and people still listen to it, which is cool. But yeah, it really. When I started working in game music, I thrust myself fully into the mod scene, and I was just like, I just said yes to anything. I did all kinds of like tiny little pieces of music. I can't even remember like all the stuff that I did back then. It was really just in the interest of gaining experience and getting some contacts, and you only need one to work out, and it can lead to all kinds of stuff. I mean, Ori led to Minecraft, which led to Halo. It's a pretty good 7-8 year run. But there were other projects that came from ModDB as well. Like I got Ark through, so Primal Carnage, which you might have been asking me about next, was my second game that shipped. Now the animation team for Primal Carnage also did animations for the early version of Ark Survival Evolved.
Oh, really? Okay.
And the team, I think this is how it went down. The Ark Survival Evolved team asked the Primal Carnage guys, do you know any composers? And of course I'd done the music for Primal Carnage, which is also a dinosaur game. And they were like, yeah, Gareth's pretty thankfully they said I was pretty good. And and then the Ark team had me pitch for their game, and my pitch ended up being the main theme for the game. So it was obviously a pretty good pitch. But literally it's version 1 as well. Like version 1 of my pitch is like the final main theme. And a good illustration of that is, so from Primal Carnage, which started out like as a mod thing, became a fully fledged game, which led to Ark, which led to me ultimately recording with a 93-piece orchestra at Abbey Road Studios. So again, from a single profile, like it ended up to me like getting to something that there's no composer in the world who doesn't want to record at Abbey Road Studios with a massive orchestra. And then Ark, obviously, there's the base game, then there's all the DLC, and there might be some stuff coming fairly soon, like that hasn't been announced, but like and Ark, actually, funnily enough, when I was hired on Halo, that was the score they referenced first, not Ori.
Really?
Because of my approach to action music and percussion. Like percussion is percussion's a big part of the Halo soundtracks, and especially Ark's quite tribal as well. The music supervisor he specifically referenced Ark first. So yeah, it's just interesting seeing where things lead.
Then just another example was like the sound designer on Primal Carnage ended up going to work for Insomniac Games. And then Insomniac Games working on a VR title, and the sound designer was able to get me a chance to pitch on that, and I ended up winning that pitch, and so I ended up scoring a VR title. And so the point I was trying to make was just like there's a crazy amount of opportunities came from that like initial profile. Like there's a whole family tree of like all of my jobs, but they all go back to like literally one source point, which is that website where I had a profile.
Actually, just after you mentioned it as well, I was kind of thinking this probably makes a lot of sense that the guys obviously doing Halo would think first of all to Ark, because they both kind of share that similarity of like you've just been dropped into a world, you don't know what's around you, and you kind of have to explore it. So I suppose there is that link there between those two titles, so captures that mystery.
Exactly.
Would you say?
Yep. Yes, exactly.
Let's just talk. So you mentioned before you did a little bit of work for Minecraft as well on the expansion packs music, and we talked a little bit about you talked very briefly about pieces of music that you picked up while in Japan and through Asian culture and all that. And obviously, I think it can be applied in the best possible scenario to the Chinese mythology pack for Minecraft. But you obviously also did the Egyptian, Greek, Norse, and a lot more in that sense as well.
Yep.
that actually sounds like, at least for a composer who's trying to, you know, expand their range and give a whole load of almost a library for people to pick from, sounds like the best possible way you could have done it, because it's so many different styles, but in such a sort of a packaged sense, if that makes any sense. How did you go around, you know, exploring elements and finding unique sounds for each of those packs?
I mean, for each of them, it's just a case of doing the research, but it's the fine balance, because what they didn't want is like a perfect recreation of Egyptian music from that era, because that's not commercially accessible. They wanted a version of that music that is accessible to a large player base, and you know, I Hollywoodized it up for all of them. So it's just about finding the instruments that are, you know, authentic, which is obviously the hardest for the Greek one because it's the oldest, and there aren't that many Greek instruments to choose from. Whereas China, China has a huge, like, rich array of instruments to choose from. But the information, we live in the age of the internet, and the information is not hard to find. And actually, for the Chinese one, I hired a specialist on her instrument for the Chinese violin, the erhu, and yeah, I mean, she basically kind of guided me, like, for the things that I can do, things that I can't do, things that are idiomatic, things that are not idiomatic. You phrase it very well, because it was a great way to gain experience of doing a lot of music in a relatively short period of time. I mean, those albums, which basically produced in 3 months for each one of the mythologies, like from composing to final recording. Compare that with Ori, which kind of took place over 3 years. Very, very different timeline. So it got me into, like, first of all, like, delivering things professionally quickly. Second of all, it's just a lot of music, so writing quickly. Third of all, having to do the research on making sure that it sounds right, like, so getting into the habit of doing that. So by the time I got to Egyptian, which was the last one, I was like, oh, it's a piece of cake, right? We're doing Egypt now. Whereas the first one was like, you know, it felt like a lot of work. But no, I'm really grateful that I got the chance to work on those, because it's a body of work that is, as he said, incredibly varied. You know, one day maybe the makers of Assassin's Creed will notice it, and I can, like, go and write a score for whatever playground they go to next. But they are well served by their current composers. So I've made no secret of the fact that I would love to score an Assassin's Creed game one day. But you know, it's as I said, they're definitely set for their composing for a while. So you know, I've got Ori, so I can't really complain.
You're probably going to need to correct my pronunciation of the two gentlemen who I'm about to mention here, their surnames. I think out of the 3 composers for Halo Infinite, you probably have the easiest name to pronounce. So when talking in an interview to Halo Waypoint, you actually talked about when you were working alongside Joel Korlitz and Curtis Schwitzer, I believe that's how you say his surname?
Schweitzer, I think.
Schweitzer, okay. You talked a little bit about how all 3 of you have your own, like, musical vocabularies and your background that makes it fundamentally different to how you all approach music. Could you maybe just give us a little insight into how you go about finding the sound of a game? Because obviously it varies depending on genre.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the project. So when you start a project, obviously everything's a blank canvas. Although on Halo it wasn't, because there's, you know, how many Halo games have there been now? But on Halo, there's we, you know, the 3 of us report to a music supervisor, who, because, you know, when you're 3 composers, you kind of want to make sure you're doing the you're all swimming in the same direction. That's where a music supervisor comes in. So we get guidance from the music supervisor and 343. But on Ori, you know, I'm calling the shots. It's you know, right down to the very, very granular stuff. But when you're starting, again, it always comes back to the game itself. It's like the gameplay. You're like looking at the gameplay and what does it need, and how do we want the player to feel? And that conversation is a consistent conversation on every single game I work on, whether it's Halo, Ori, Darksiders, Minecraft, doesn't matter. How do you want the player to feel when they're playing the game? And I think I think that conversation doesn't happen on other games all the time. Like I feel like I can tell the games which did have that conversation and which didn't. They're just like, we need some music and let's get it in. No, it's a lot more than that. There's a common theme in this interview where it's like, what does the player want to experience? Because I think that is the fundamentally most important thing when writing game music. And when you have answered that question at least a little bit, that's when you start talking about instruments, scales, harmony, melody, and stuff. Because all of those things, if you're musically literate, I don't mean like in terms of academic, it just means if you have experience writing music, you kind of know what devices you can use to at least start heading towards that direction. But hopefully you don't use too many of them, because then you're just going to write something that you've done before. You obviously want to do something you see, maybe take a little bit of something you've done before to give you a starting point. This is how I work. Like, everyone works differently, but like, if there's a scene in Halo or a scene in Ori or whatever that needs a certain feel, I'm going to go to what I know first. I'm like, okay, what can I do that's new and interesting, that's still appropriate in this world based on the visuals that I've seen, and based on what the gameplay is going to be. But it really all does stem from like that initial conversation about how do we want the player to feel. Because what's the point in writing anything if you don't know what you want the player to experience when you're playing it? You're just going to throw it out. The one thing I do try to do fairly early on is, if we're using melodic themes, that's something you want to be able to draw upon, because it removes another equation from the blank canvas. If you have, because you can write a melody without knowing what the gameplay is, and then it can be adapted the melody can be adapted to have the right feel for that moment in the gameplay. I mean, look at how many times I've reworked the Ori melody across the main menu theme across the two games. It's a lot, because it's flexible and it's malleable. If it's a strong melody, it should be malleable across multiple genres and styles. But so yeah, that's something that can be done a little bit earlier on. But then in terms of the rest of it, it's kind of informed by what we want the player to feel.
Just out of interest, when you obviously mentioned you were playing games since the age of 4, was Halo on your radar constantly? Was it one of your favorite titles, or?
No, I mean, I like the game, but I'm just bad at shooters. I'm not anymore. I was bad at shooters when I was young. So I got into shooters a little bit later. No, I was playing real-time strategy and single player adventure games of the LucasArts kinds, where you have to solve silly puzzles and stuff like that. But yeah, my jam was Warcraft, and not World of Warcraft. Again, the single player games. If I was doing multiplayer, it would have been with my dad, and that's about it. But I did play my fair share of Call of Duty or Medal of Honor. But Halo I got into later. It's actually kind of fun revisiting Halo now, because they've basically remastered all of the games in the Master Chief Collection, which is a pretty impressive collection now. And the fact that you can get it as part of your Game Pass subscription, I don't want to sound like a Game Pass salesman, but it's just like, well, Microsoft don't need any help selling Game Pass.
No, they don't.
But it's a tremendous deal just for that block of games alone. And it's been fun, because obviously, when I was contracted to do Infinite, I was like, right, time to dive back in and get familiar. You have to get familiar with the. I was talking about being musically literate. You have to be familiar with the language of whatever you're working on, especially if there's existing language. I'm talking about musical language. Ori, though, I created it. Like, it's my musical language. I'm not going to do every Ori game. At least I don't think so. If there's, I can't say what will come to the future. Nothing's planned. But let's say that we get to Ori 10. I think I'm going to be done by then. It's like so someone else will have to take the musical language and develop it, or take it somewhere else, and that'd be pretty cool to hear. John Williams has done 9 Star Wars films. I think he's done enough. Yeah, I think probably he would be excited to see where someone else is going to take it, because it's something that he wouldn't have thought of. Yeah, one of my favorite things, sorry, it's just a slight tangent, but I think it's a good thing to talk about. It's all the covers that appear of game soundtracks on YouTube. Like the amount of musicians doing, I never thought there would be a metal cover of Ori.
Is there actually?
Oh yeah, and it's actually good. Yeah, it's actually really, really good. Like he caught the spirit of the song in the arrangement, and that's really what a good cover should do. The instrument shouldn't matter. It's can you capture the spirit of the song? Yeah, it's a metal cover of Shriek and Ori, which is the final boss fight track from. It's a 6-minute cover, like significant amount of work. Yeah. You obviously transcribed it by ear. Like that stuff is kind of cool. Like I think. I'll continue, working on, let's just say Ori, as long as I have something to say. And as long as, that's why I was really happy to get the chance to do Ori 2, because I was like, I didn't feel done with it at Ori 1. And in Ori 2, I kind of left everything out there. And, I don't know what's going to happen down the line. But if, if the story's there and, it could be 2030 or 2040 or whatever. But if the story's there and maybe I still have something to say, then I still work on it. But if I don't feel like I have anything to say or anything to add, then maybe someone else will, and that would be very, very interesting to hear another composer's take on the world, because they'll do their own spin on it. Yeah, like creating that language was. It took a long time. It takes a long time to figure out like what a game needs. When you're starting out with that blank canvas.
Just out of interest as well, when you were talking about jumping into the Halo games to kind of get that feel for them, did you go chronologically starting with Reach, or did you start in order of release?
No, I paid attention. I started. It's the true chronological order in terms of the canon.
Where do you put Halo 3 ODST then? Because obviously that takes place in between a bit of 2, and then it kind of overlaps into 3 near the end.
I put it between Halo 2 and 3.
Yeah, I think that's a good shout, in fairness. So you've passed on flying colors in that one.
But yeah, I'm sure there's a whole bunch of theory online about like where to play things. I think someone had made a thread on one of the online gaming forums, what order should you play the Halo games in? And I think I just followed that. Otherwise I get lost in doing too much research myself, and I was like, I need to actually just play them. And so if I hadn't found the answer, I would have just played them in the order that they were released. Which obviously is very different, but it can give you a different perspective on things. But no, I played them based on that thread order, and I was like, that's a pretty good guide. So.
Yeah, because I would actually consider myself quite a big fan of the Halo games. But even when I go online, I saw someone had broken down, which missions in Halo 3 ODST take place before and during Halo 2. And it's just like, how are you thinking of this up? Like, obviously, because there's a whole thing in ODST where it's like 6 months after, 6 hours after drop, or because it takes place, I think, all in an entire day or something is the whole whole gimmick of it. But anyways, that's going off on a tangent again. Talking we're kind of sticking with Halo, but more talking about general games with regards to scoring. And when talking about, you mentioned before that there's a moment within a game that everyone will remember, and the score has to obviously accompany that and make it memorable. And you mentioned that 200 minutes of music is never going to be memorable because there's just so much content to look at. And in regards to Halo, there's sort of I think two ones that always stick out to me is in the first Halo game, when you come out of the Forerunner tunnel, the music sort of blares and it lets everything else is silent. And then there's also at the end of Halo 3 when jumping onto the forward onto Dawn, and he sees the arc blowing up behind Master Chief, and he's looking at Cortana, and that's obviously something that's ingrained into every player's mind. The question is, how do you sort of know when that moment's coming up? Is it something that's conveyed to you by the writers, or is it just sort of natural?
You got to feel it. You got to play the game and figure it out. Like it's, I mean, you kind of know early on going in, like I think every game has these kind of pillars that they kind of build around. and you want those moments to like really hit. So you think about that. But the reason those moments hit is not because obviously you have to execute them like at the moment that they hit, but it's actually what happens before and what happens after is what makes the pillar as powerful as it is. So you got to think about how are you going to build up to make that moment effective. We talked about ET earlier. Everything built like you can't just play that big music cue without like all of the build up with the story and the music and the foreshadowing that happens before all of that. And it's the same with the iconic moments in games, the things that we all remember. It's about the pacing around them. It's not necessarily just the moment itself. It's everyone always talks about how the water chase in Ori made them feel because it was it's the first, you're escaping and rushing up. But to me, that is just the high point of the symphony, because that actually starts the moment you enter the tree at the very bottom, and you've got all of those little rooms and you can constantly work yourself up. But we haven't actually reached the escape sequence yet, like, because the pacing is slow. But then you get Bash halfway up the tree, so you got a new ability, and now things become a bit more exciting. You're kind of zipping around the map, and then finally you get to the chase sequence, and it's like, oh my god, this is crazy. So now you're up to like 10 on the intensity level. You complete the chase sequence, you think you're done. Because there's a relief point, but it's like, no, not yet, you're not done, because then we introduce Kuro, the antagonist, and then you have a cutscene, and then only then are you truly done. And I was like, okay, well, my thinking behind that, I was like, Ori's still in danger, obviously, but he's just freed the water of the forest, and everything's like super green now, and it's safe to swim in the water. And I was like, I don't care how much danger is in this scene, Ori's going to be relaxed now, and this player's state of mind is going to be relaxed. And so the music is really relaxing, like literally 30 seconds after Ori's just been thrown off a cliff and saved by Gumo. But I'm like, this is what the player is feeling now. They are feeling relief that they're okay, and the music needs to be relieving. But the relief afterwards heightens the moment that just came before because of the contrast. And then the moment, the high point with the chase and the cutscene at the top was all built up to gradually as you're ascending the Ginzo tree, doing all of the different puzzle rooms. So all of these moments, whether it's Halo, whether it's Ori, whether it's Hellblade, you're thinking not just about the moment themselves, but the pacing around them. And we know the pillars, but where the real work happens is like the building into the pillars. That's where the back and forth is crazy. Like you cannot do it in isolation. Like you got to talk all the time with the departments. Like just some quick example is like sometimes I ask like, hey, can I get like a couple more seconds before the chase actually starts? Which for the animation team means extending like the light burst, because the tree starts glowing, and then it it kind of explodes, and then the chase starts. I was like, hey, can I get a couple more seconds here, because it's going to allow me to build the music a little bit more. And the animation team's like, oh my god, we've got to do that. We've got to tweak the animation, but like Gareth says it's going to work, and then of course it did. And then there's literally thousands of little decisions like that help improve the pacing, that make the moment as effective as it is. So the reason why you don't have so many of them, especially in open world games, is because open world games are systems based rather than like scripted moments. The best open world games balance the systems with like these scripted, fancy, like impressive moments that really connect with the player. But if it's purely systems based, man, your systems better be good, because that's I think there's something to be said for like the player can create their own moments, and that is true. That also can be very special. But sometimes, especially when it comes to the narrative, the player needs their hand to be held, and to hold the hand of the player, you've got to think about all of that scripting stuff. So whenever I think of these moments in games, like they're when you, like I said, when you play a game for 50 hours and there's a 200-minute score, you're not going to remember all of it. No one remembers all of the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, but they're always going to remember the first time they heard dun, 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 when you fly over Isengard and see all the orcs. You're going to remember that every time, because like everything else gets out the way. There's no sound effects. You're just seeing a giant like hellscape with a bunch of orcs, and it's like there's nothing else to do but make a musical statement. And so you remember that moment because they've thought about what they want the most important thing to be. And Lord of the Rings has so many iconic moments, and there's all the bits in between, but those iconic moments are built up to so perfectly, and paced so well. And that's what that's when you go and see a film, play a game, especially like these epic films and these epic games, you just want to give the player or the viewer something that they're going to remember forever. And how many moments from Lord of the Rings will you remember forever? There are so many. How many moments from Halo will we remember forever? How many moments from Ori? There are a lot of moments in Ori that I think people will remember forever. And that's like, that's really why I get out of bed in the morning. Like, I want the game to be fun for the whole time, but I want to give you an experience that will shake you to your core. For whatever reason, whether it's an epic boss fight or an emotional scene or both, that you'll remember for a long time. And there's nothing worse than having sat through a 3-hour epic film. I don't mind putting this on record. I'm not a huge fan of a lot of the Marvel movies because I know that what I'm watching, it's expensive and it looks good and it's spectacular, but I can't remember any of it. And that's just me. And I'm paying attention, but I can't really remember that much of it. Even though it's spectacular. There's that happens in games too. And again, I talked about like the difference between good games and great games, on a musical level, but I think also on a much larger scale, when it comes to games, you can make a good game with good systems, but actually what's going to take it from good to great is like, what's that moment that players are never going to forget? One of my favorite moments in film of the last decade is when Miles jumps off the roof Into the Spider-Verse. I mean, everyone recalls that scene because it's just like he's realized who he is. It's a moment that like the whole movie switches around. One of my other favorite moments from film in the last 10 years. Have you seen Dunkirk?
I have, yeah.
Right. The whole film centers around the boats appearing. It's literally a shot of some boats. that is the most important shot in the entire movie. And everything like turns around, like the camera gradually turns, and you see the person's face. Like that's like the beginning of the moment. And then that's like, okay, we're about to have the release point. And then you finally see the boats. And for the briefest of moments, you understand what it might have been like for a soldier seeing his countrymen come over the horizon to come and rescue them. Finally, like you have a moment like where you believe you might actually make it, because the whole movie, and a lot of people don't like the movie because it's hyper real. And I'm like, that's the point of the movie. They wanted to make you feel like a soldier in that movie. So when the boats come over the horizon, you feel the relief that they feel. And that's a moment I'll never forget. Like, and that's what I want when I go to see a film or play a game or watch a TV show.
Mm-hmm. There's two things I kind of want to pick up on that, and I know I've taken a lot of your time already, and I have two more questions.
I've got 15 minutes, so
okay,
yeah,
perfect.
I definitely have to go at the top of the hour.
Perfect. I'll run through very quickly. One of the things I noticed when you're talking about the Marvel movies, there's a really good video out there that talks about.
I know the one you're going to talk about.
Yeah, the one about the reoccurring themes of characters and all that. Is that accurate in your terms with regards to?
I think I haven't watched all of the Marvel movies because there's so many of them. But what I did say is, when it's I think the music for the Marvel movies is fine. So it does the job. But to create the moments, whether it's a Marvel movie or a horror film or a video game, it's another example of one of those things where you can't create in a vacuum. You have to be in communication with all of the other departments. And I think what can sometimes happen on a really, really, really massive project, whether it's a film or a game, the cross talk between departments doesn't happen sometimes. So there's less opportunity to create those like magic moments that we're all looking for. They still happen, even on the biggest projects. I mean, Christopher Nolan's like a master of it. Like, you know, there's always a crazy moment in every Christopher Nolan movie, not just visually, but in terms of music as well.
Yeah.
You know, he made the docking sequence interesting. Like, you know, how can a docking sequence be interesting? But it is. And I'm actually not a huge fan of Interstellar as a movie, but I will remember the docking scene for the rest of my life because it was pretty good. And it was skillfully shot, and music's good, and all of that. It's funny because even in, you know, movies that I don't enjoy, there's you can still like see what they were going for, like with the moment that they're trying to hit. And it's the same in games. Like even like maybe, you know, a 7 out of 10 game, if it has a moment like or two that like gives me something I can remember forever, I actually value it more than something that's just well made but flat throughout. I want peaks and valleys in my entertainment experience. I think everyone does. Like if it's flat and good, it's actually not going to feel as good by the end of it because you didn't have those, you know, those highs and lows. It's really just all about tension and release, to be honest. Like that's the entertainment industry in a nutshell.
I suppose this final question then ties it all up. We talked at the beginning about which composers and elements of composition inspired you the most. And obviously, I think your work now, while you still have a long way to go, has inspired so many composers who are thinking of getting into the industry. If we were to look maybe 50, 100 years down the line, when you're, we'll say you're probably finished composition in 100 years' time. I think it's a safe bet.
Well, unless I've downloaded my brain, Elon Musk style. Like, yeah.
How would you like not only your work but you as a composer to be remembered?
I mean, I've hinted at this throughout the call. It's less about my music. It's about how it enhanced the experience it was attached to. Like that is the thing I value most. If we're going to talk on a musical level, I want to be remembered for the melodies. That's it. I don't care about any of the rest of it, whether it's orchestra. And I think I've probably already ticked that box. Between Ori and Arc, you know, I'm not being modest here, but those are two pretty strong melodies. But you know, I want to write more of them. But no, the thing I would most want to be remembered for, whether it's film, game, or TV, is just the synergy between the music and whatever I work on, because that is the thing I spend a ton of time on. It's just writing music for picture is so much more than just supplying a nicely recorded product. There's so much thought that goes into it. You know, I've just talked about Lord of the Rings. Howard Shore annotated the entire trilogy with, like, you know, he's famous for like having done his research on the books. He read them inside out, and he'd like already mapped out like themes for his characters. And I think Peter Jackson was like, well, how can I not give this guy the job when he's done this much research, you know? And he delivered one of the greatest, certainly one of the greatest trilogy scores of all time. You know, it's up there with Star Wars and the Harry Potter scores, and you know, he's in, like, it's in that level. And it's because he. Can you imagine any other music in Lord of the Rings? No, it's impossible. And it's funny because Lord of the Rings probably gets referenced a lot by like other fantasy games. Yeah, we want it to sound like that, and the thing is, it never will. It'll just sound like second rate. What they really want is that they don't want it to sound like Lord of the Rings. What they really want is they want their own fantasy game to have its own identity, because Lord of the Rings, you can listen to 5 seconds of that soundtrack and you know it's Lord of the Rings. Like, and that's another sign of a great soundtrack. If you can listen to a handful of seconds of it, you can be like, yep, I know what that is. That's a result, not just of a composer who's skilled with, you know, writing music, but of a composer like understanding 100% exactly what that game, film, TV show needs. And so that's the thing I'd want to be remembered for.
Perfect. Gareth, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and we'll have to talk again sometime in the future, but thank you so much for your time.
No worries.